In this presentation, I'm going to talk about an example wildlife tax valuation plan and how you would go forward with identifying your practices and filling out the plan to send to the appraisal district. And in this situation, I actually want to use an actual plan. This is my wildlife tax valuation plan for my property that I purchased in 2019 and applied for the wildlife tax valuation for 2020. This was actually sent to the appraisal district in Atascosa County, and I did receive the wildlife tax valuation designation. So when talking about the wildlife valuation and you're looking at your property, what you want to do is you want to identify the current status of the property. What do you have? What's there? Those kinds of things. And then secondly, what are the goals for the wildlife species that you want to target? And finally, what management practices will meet my goals and help the targeted wildlife? So in this situation, my current property is 25 acres. It's a deep sandy soil type, and it's in Atascosa County, in the northern part of Atascosa County, and it's in the Post Oak Savannah ecological region. It currently had, when I purchased it, had the 1D1 appraisal for traditional agricultural use. The property is primarily open with a few large live oak trees and post oak trees. The open area is tall, thick grass, hasn't been grazed in a little while. It's the vast majority of the grass is an exotic species called weeping lovegrass. Historically, the property was an agricultural field, probably back about 30, 40 years ago, where they planted watermelons and peanuts and things like that. And then it was planted in this exotic grass to promote cattle grazing. So what are my wildlife management goals and my targeted wildlife species? Well, my wildlife management goals are to remove the exotic vegetation and promote native grassland habitat for native wildlife. Native grassland habitat, wildlife viewing, and hunting are my primary interests. Species of interest for me include northern bobwhite, mourning dove, waterfowl, Mexican free-tailed bats, white-tailed deer, white-winged dove, and wild turkey. You'll see that this is a pretty large list of wildlife species that I'm interested in, but it definitely matches for the things that I really want to do. These are the species that I most want to promote, and so I wanted to make sure that I listed all the ones that I want to promote. When you're doing your wildlife valuation plan, you don't need a large number of species. You need just a few of those species that can be managed on that property. So then we want to talk about what wildlife management practices will help meet my goals and promote my targeted wildlife species. Remember those 7 practices that we've continued to talk about throughout this workshop: habitat control, erosion control, predator control, providing supplemental water, providing supplemental food, providing supplemental shelter, and performing census counts or surveys. In my situation, I picked the 3 primary practices that I knew I could do every year, and then I have additional practices that are added into my annual report just to show the other things I'm doing. So the first thing that I did was worked on supplemental water. We did build a house in 2020 on the property, so we had to have a water well. Once we had the water well dug, I actually put in a pipeline from the well to the existing pond that we had created back in 2019. The pond is a small earthen pond, and I have a small a 2-inch pipeline that goes from the well to that water to the pond that was dug in 19. So the goal is to maintain water levels throughout the year to provide an access to for wildlife to free water. By providing water through this, by actively providing water through the pipeline, this allows me to use this as one of my practices. It does add a lot of value to me because it attracts dove as well as waterfowl, as well as provides a lot of use by other wildlife species, such as white-tailed deer and things like that. The next practice that I initiated was providing supplemental shelter. I installed 2 large bat boxes on the property. The first bat box is up near where my house is, actually, because I want to be able to see those bats leave the bat box, maybe when I'm sitting at a fire pit or something like that. The other bat box is on the far end of the property by the pond, because bats like to have free access to water as well. So having it near the pond provides some of that use. The bat boxes are at least 10 feet high and they're facing southeast. So there's my second practice, providing supplemental shelter. I installed those bat boxes in 2020, and then I just maintain those boxes throughout the time to make sure that they're still available for the bats to use. My third practice that I will perform every single year are performing census counts/surveys. I use spring songbird surveys with emphasis on northern bobwhites. Did a minimum of 3 surveys during April and May. Each survey was a 10-minute sit at a site starting approximately at sunrise, and I actually identify the total number of individual northern bobwhites calling within, it's usually for bobwhites, it's usually within about 3, 4, 500 yards that I could hear. Maybe as I get older, my hearing won't be as good, but right now I can hear pretty far. And so I actually identified how many individuals I heard calling in that 10-minute span. Then I also tried to identify other individual birds like mourning doves, white-winged doves, different sparrows, turkeys, cardinals, things like that, just to get an idea of what other species might be around. I conduct this survey every single year during that April and May timeframe, so I can evaluate how things are going across time. And then for my annual report, I send that data into the appraisal district so that they know that I've performed this at a agreeable level. So those are my 3 primary practices that I conduct every single year. Those got put into my wildlife tax valuation plan, and the appraisal district knows that those are my primary practices that I'm performing. I am doing additional practices, but depending on climate or things like that, I might not be able to do all of them each year. So those are my additional practices that go into my annual report, and I'm going to talk about some of those practices. The one additional practice that I'm working on over time is habitat control. One of those things that I'm doing is waterfowl is a big interest of mine. So I've actually, in 2020, I transported native vegetation from a neighbor's pond to my new pond. I transported muskgrass, southern naiad, and little leaf pondweed. The goal is to get basically a salad bowl within this shallow water pond to promote wintering waterfowl use. The second thing that I'm working on, which is a long-term project for me, is my goal is to slowly eliminate the exotic grass on the property and plant it back to native grasses. So I'm using little plots at a time, each year doing a little plot at a time of trying to fully eliminate that exotic grass and replant to natives. This is probably going to be a 10-year practice for me, but I do enjoy it, and it adds a lot of value to myself for the property. Another practice that I do when available is predator control, actually feral hog trapping. One, we like to eat feral hogs ourselves, but also there's quite a few feral hogs in the area. So put out a trap and began trapping feral hogs in 2020. And I documented by a great thing about cell phones is you can take a picture and it'll actually give you a timestamp of when those animals were trapped. And so you can keep track of how many you might trap throughout the year. And I've done that. In 2020, I trapped 8 feral hogs, but hopefully in 21 I'll trap more of them. Another practice I installed in the fall of 2020 was I installed a cottonseed feeder for white-tailed deer. I chose cottonseed over corn for several reasons. One, the cottonseed feeder is not too far from my pond, and I do want to do some migratory bird hunting, dove and waterfowl hunting. Luckily, the cottonseed isn't an attractant for those species, so I can supplementally feed the white-tailed deer and not be affecting my the migratory birds that I want to hunt. Secondly, the feral hogs don't really eat it very much. And thirdly, the raccoons and stuff like that don't eat it. So cottonseed is, for me, was a great supplement to kind of improve some of those, add some interest for those other wildlife species, and it also was really fun for harvest and for seeing deer and things like that. So in summary, in my plan, my 5-year plan, I put in these practices in 3 categories: supplemental water, supplemental shelter, and population survey. And then in my additional practices that I intend to enact, but may have not have happened every year or something like that, were habitat control, predator control, and supplemental food. So I filled out the tax valuation plan, that 10-page plan that y'all will see, and I did my boxes, and then I added a summary page with pictures of the feeders, of the pond, the pipeline, things like that, so they have an idea. The appraisal district has an idea where those things are. And I also included a map of the property of where all the different things like the water well, the pipeline, the bat houses, my native grass restoration area, the cottonseed feeder, and the pig trap. This way, when the appraisal district gets my summary, gets my plan, they'll have an idea of where those things are put in place before they actually come out on the property and things like that to make sure that we're doing the things that we're doing. This has worked out for me. I haven't had any issues with the appraisal district, and annually I send in a checkbox report with a summary and again with the pictures and things like that of the practices that I've done. And throughout the years, I will probably do some additional practices, and so that annual report is my way of tuning my own horn, of showing them the things that I've accomplished and proving to the appraisal district that I'm serious about the wildlife management that I'm doing.